She was 60 years old, and her children had just divided everything that mattered and handed her the one thing they were certain was worthless. The house she had lived in for 31 years went to her daughter in the settlement. The savings account went to legal fees. What was left was a boarded-up cannery on the Oregon coast that her late husband had bought on impulse in 1987 for reasons he had never fully explained, and that nobody had set foot in since the winter he died 7 years ago. Her son called it a liability. Her daughter said the same word in a different tone, which was worse. But what neither of them knew, what Dorothy Crane herself did not know, standing in the gravel lot outside that cannery on a gray Tuesday in March with a salt wind coming off the water and nowhere else to go, was that behind the ice room at the back of the building, her husband had left something that he had spent the last years of his life quietly making sure she would find, something that would settle every debt and prove, without a word said in anger, that the man they had underestimated had understood exactly what he was doing all along. If stories like this one mean something to you, I hope you'll subscribe before we go any further. It's free, and it keeps these stories coming. And tell me where you're watching from today. Your city, your state, wherever you are. I read every one. Dorothy Crane had grown up in a landlocked town in eastern Oregon called Ridley, where the nearest body of water large enough to matter was a reservoir 12 miles out that froze in January and smelled of algae in July. She had not expected the sea. She had not expected much of what her life turned out to be, which was not a complaint. It was simply the truth that life, in her experience, arrived in a shape you hadn't drawn. She had met her husband, Martin, when she was 24, at a diner in Portland where she was waiting tables on weekends to supplement the income from a weekday job at a print shop. Martin had come in on a Thursday evening with a friend she didn't remember, sat at the counter, ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and had talked to her for so long that the pie went cold, and the friend left, and the dinner rush came and went around them without either of them fully noticing. He was 31 and worked as a civil engineer for a county roads department, a job that suited him in the way that jobs suit people who like solving problems with their hands as much as their heads. He was tall and deliberate in his movements, the kind of person who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he did. And he had a quality Dorothy recognized from her father, a quality she later thought of simply as reliability, the sense that the person standing next to you would still be there when you turned around. She had not always had that growing up, and she understood its value the way you understand the value of things whose absence you have felt. They married the following year. They moved to a small coastal town called Harlan Bay, which Martin had chosen because the county road work had brought him there for a project, and he had looked at the bay on a clear morning and simply not wanted to leave. Dorothy had not objected. She had looked at the same bay on the same morning and felt the same thing, and they had understood without discussion that this was where they were going to be. She found a job at the local library within 3 months of arriving, a part-time position that became full-time within a year, and that suited her in ways she had not quite anticipated. The organizing of things, the making of information findable, the particular satisfaction of knowing where everything was and being the person others came to when they couldn't find what they were looking for. She worked there for 22 years and loved most of it in the quiet way you love a place that asks something useful of you every day. She knew every shelf, every catalog quirk, every patron who arrived on a schedule without quite knowing they were on one. The retired fisherman who came in every Tuesday for maritime history. The woman who had read every novel in the 830 section and was working through it again. The teenage boy who sat in the back corner after school every day, doing homework he claimed not to have. She knew the smell of the building in each season, and the specific creak of the third step on the back staircase, and which windows stuck in August, and which ones let in the cold in January. When she finally left, 22 years in, She said goodbye to the building as she said goodbye to people, which is to say, not easily. They had 2 children, a son named Paul, born when Dorothy was 28. His father's deliberateness, his mother's stubbornness, grew up to be an accountant in Portland who was good at his work and not particularly warm in the way that some people who are very good at their work are not. And a daughter named Renata, 4 years younger than Paul, who had inherited from neither parent the specific quality that would have made things easier. She was quick and certain and usually right, and certain about the remaining things as well, which was harder for everyone around her. Martin had always been a man with projects. There was always something in the garage, something on the workbench. Dorothy had assumed retirement would simply mean more of that. A longer version of the weekends he had always spent happily and quietly occupied. She was not wrong about this exactly. She did not anticipate the projects themselves, however, or the scale of certain ones, or the deliberate quiet with which he pursued them. He bought the Cannery the year he retired at 63. He had driven past it for years on the coast road and apparently been thinking about it for some time without saying so. It had been closed since 1979, when the salmon run that had supported it declined past the point of commercial viability, and it had sat boarded and salt-weathered through the 80s and 90s without attracting any buyer willing to take it on. Martin paid $11,000 for it without consulting Dorothy in advance, which was unlike him, and which she noted without making much of, because Martin was not a person who did things without reasons, even when he didn't share the reasons yet. He spent time there, several mornings a week, telling her he was going to the Cannery, coming back in the afternoon with sawdust on his jacket or salt on his boots, and a particular quality of quiet satisfaction she recognized from 30 years of watching him work. She asked what he was doing out there. He said he was fixing things. She asked which things. He said all kinds. She understood that this was true, and also not the complete answer, and she understood from those same 30 years that the complete answer would arrive when he was ready to give it. He died of a stroke at 68, on a Wednesday morning in November, 5 years into his retirement and into whatever it was the Cannery had become in his private hours. He came downstairs for coffee and did not make it to the kitchen. It was swift, and she was grateful for that afterward in the strange, slow gratitude of grief. But it left no room for goodbyes and no room for the conversation she had always assumed they would eventually have about what he had been building out there all those years. The Cannery sat as it was. She hadn't been able to go. Grief does different things to different people. And what it did to Dorothy in the first 2 years after Martin died was make everything that had been abstract feel very concrete, and everything that had been concrete feel very far away. The practical things, the death certificates, the accounts, the small necessary reorganization of a life, she moved through steadily. The rest was harder. She kept his reading glasses on the nightstand on his side of the bed for 4 months, because she could not decide where else to put them. She kept buying the brand of coffee he preferred, even though she had always preferred a different one, because buying a different coffee felt like admitting something she was not ready to admit. In the months after Martin died, she had driven the coast road several times and slowed when the building came into view. The long, low shape of it against the gray sky, the boarded windows, the rusted track above the loading dock, and each time she had kept driving. She told herself she wasn't ready. Things did not settle in the way she had expected, because Paul and Renata had begun, within the first year, the slow, steady process of convincing her to sell the house in Harlan Bay, which was too large for one person, and which contained, they said reasonably, more equity than she should leave, sitting in a structure she couldn't maintain alone. They were not wrong. She acknowledged they weren't wrong. What she couldn't find the words to tell them was that the house was the last place that felt like her life, and that giving it up felt not like a practical decision, but like being subtracted from yourself. She gave it up anyway. She was 60 years old and not interested in spending the energy it would take to fight two determined adult children over something she couldn't articulate clearly enough to win. What remained after the sale and the fees and Martin's outstanding small debts was almost nothing. The Cannery, which Paul had had assessed by a commercial property agent who valued it somewhere between a tear-down cost and a minor inconvenience, was the one thing nobody wanted to fight over, and nobody wanted to deal with. Paul suggested donating it to the county. Renata suggested selling it for whatever the land might bring, which was not much given the zoning. Both of them presented these options to Dorothy in the particular way of people who have already decided and are informing rather than discussing. Dorothy said she would think about it. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she stopped thinking and started packing. She did not tell them that she had nowhere else to go. It would have been difficult to say without sounding like an accusation, and it was not an accusation. Her children had not set out to leave her with nothing. They had simply moved through the situation as though the math of it were the whole of it. Paul lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, and the second bedroom was a home office. Renata lived in Seattle with a husband and 2 children, and a life that was full in the way, that left no natural room for a mother to insert herself. These were not crimes. Dorothy packed 4 boxes into the back seat of her car and paid 3 months on a storage unit, and drove to Harlan Bay on a gray Tuesday in March, and parked in the gravel lot outside the Cannery, and sat for a moment with the salt wind off the water, and then got out. The building was larger than it looked from the road. She had driven past this structure for 30 years, and had never actually stood in front of it and understood how much of it there was. A main processing floor, from the size of the exterior. A cold storage section on the north end. The loading dock with its rusted track along the south wall, and at the back, visible as a separate low-roofed addition joined to the main structure by a short corridor, the ice room, where the catch had been kept before the processing began. The front door was not locked. Boarded, 2 planks nailed across the frame from the outside, but not locked. When she worked the planks free with a flathead from Martin's old toolbox, the door behind them opened without resistance, as if it had been expecting someone from the outside. The processing floor smelled of salt and old metal and something underneath both of those that she couldn't name at first, and then could. The smell of work. Of a floor that had been regularly stood on. Of a space treated as what it was. She walked its length slowly. The concrete was maintained clean, not original clean, but swept and kept, debris gathered and removed on a regular schedule. The old equipment left when the Cannery closed in 1979 had been stabilized. Bolts tightened. Rust treated where it had advanced too far. The most dangerous loose edges secured with new metal brackets she could see were not original. Martin had been here. Martin had been here regularly, for years taking care of it. Not because he had to, because it was his. She stood in the middle of the processing floor and stayed there for a long time. If you're still with me, thank you. Because what Dorothy found behind the ice room is the part of this story I have been carrying since I first heard it. If you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you will before we go any further, and if you know someone who needs to hear something like this today, I hope you'll share it with them. She did not go to the ice room first. She walked the rest of the building. She wanted to understand the whole of what Martin had done before she opened the door she had been driving past without opening for 7 years. The cold storage section on the north end still held its insulation, which surprised her. The wooden racks along the walls had been reinforced, She could see the newer joinery alongside the original, the work recognizable to her from decades of watching Martin build things in their garage. The loading dock had new decking boards in two places where the old ones had rotted through, the replacement wood still slightly lighter than the surrounding original planking, the difference honest and unmistaken. She spent most of that first day walking the building, learning it. 2 days later, while she was sweeping the processing floor, she had borrowed a broom from the hardware store and was staying in a room at the Harlan Bay Motor Court by the week. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was in her early 80s, small and deliberate in the way of people who have been economical with their movements for a long time. Carrying a thermos under one arm and wearing rubber boots that had been good ones once. Her name was June Tasker. She had seen the light in the building and come to see who was in it. She said she had worked at the Cannery in its last years of operation on the sorting tables and had been watching the building from a distance ever since, in the way that you watch something you care about and cannot do anything about. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the thermos without asking whether Dorothy wanted one and handed her a cup, and they stood together in the middle of the processing floor, and June talked about what it had been like when the cannery was running. The cold of the sorting room even in summer. The particular easy silence of the women at the tables, women who had worked alongside each other long enough that talking and not talking felt the same. The smell of the fish and the sound of the machinery and the way the morning light came through the high windows on the east wall at a specific angle that made the water in the catch bins look like hammered silver. "Your husband used to come by," June said, "years ago. He asked me questions about what it was like, what it smelled like, what the machine sounded like, what the women talked about when they talked." She looked at the old equipment along the wall. He wanted to understand it, not just fix it up, understand what it had been. Dorothy looked at the same wall. "He was like that," she said. June stayed 2 hours and came back the following morning with her thermos, and the morning after that. And by the end of that first week, Dorothy knew more about the cannery and about Harlan Bay than she had known in 3 decades of living nearby. The families who had worked the salmon run, the years of good fishing and the years that weren't. The slow and unhappy decade of the decline. The morning in 1979 when the last boat came in, and everyone understood that it was the last one without anyone having to say so. June knew all of it, and told it with the precision of someone who has been keeping it safe in their memory against the day when there would be someone worth telling. It was on the 5th day, after June had gone and the afternoon light had gone flat, that Dorothy finally walked through the short corridor to the ice room. The door was heavy, built to hold temperature, with a rubber gasket seal around the frame that had dried and cracked over the decades. The latch was a heavy steel bar, and it moved when she lifted it, the mechanism recently oiled. She pulled the door open. Behind the ice room was not the ice room. The door opened not into cold storage, but into a short passage, 4 feet long, new framing, pine, carefully joined. The ice room's original sealed door stood at the far end. On either side of the passage, built into the new framing, were shelves, and on the shelves, in the careful labeled order of a man who liked things to be findable, were Martin's records. 14 binders, each labeled by year in his handwriting, running from 1988 to the year he died. She pulled the first one and opened it, and sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the shelves. Inside, receipts and permits and photographs. Structural surveys in Martin's engineering hand, cross-checked by a licensed firm. Correspondence with the State Historic Preservation Office, going back to 1994. Letters to and from a university architecture department that was cataloging vernacular industrial buildings of the Pacific Coast. And in the binder marked 2001, the letterhead of something called the Pacific Coast Heritage Foundation. a foundation that provided grants for the restoration and adaptive reuse of historic working structures. She read through the binders in order. It took the rest of the afternoon and into the early evening, the light in the passage shifting from gray to near dark before she finished, and she did not stop to turn on the work lamp she had brought, because she did not want to stop. The last binder, the one covering Martin's final year, held a legal document near the front, a preliminary agreement between Martin Crane, owner of record, and the Pacific Coast Heritage Foundation, outlining a restoration grant, a historic preservation easement, and terms under which the cannery would be managed as a heritage site, generating a sustainable income for the property owner in perpetuity. It was dated 4 months before the stroke. It had not been signed. Martin had died before he could sign it, and without knowing it existed. Nobody had followed up. Near the back of the last binder, not in a folder and not labeled, just folded once, set between the back cover and the last page, as if placed there in a hurry or in a moment when careful filing had suddenly seemed beside the point, she almost missed it. A letter. 2 pages, handwritten, dated 3 weeks before he died. He had not addressed it to anyone. It began, "I have been meaning to finish this for a while, and I keep not finishing it. So I am going to write it now, even if it is not finished." He wrote about the cannery. He wrote about why he had bought it, not for money, and not because he had known what he was going to do with it. He had bought it because he had stood outside it one morning and felt that it was the kind of thing that ought to be kept, and he had trusted that the meaning would come if he paid attention long enough. He wrote about the foundation and the grant and the agreement that was almost but not yet signed, and about why he had not told her. He had wanted to tell her when it was done. He had always thought there would be more time. He wrote, "I have been wrong about a lot of things, but this is the one I am most sorry about." He wrote, "If you are reading this, then something went sideways, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry you have had to find this yourself instead of me showing you. But I need you to know that I thought about you every day I worked on it. Everything I did here, I did because I wanted you to have something that was yours, not ours. Yours, something nobody could divide or assess or tell you what to do with. I wanted you to have something that would last." And then, at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting slightly less careful than the rest, as if he had been tired, or moved, or both, "You always knew where everything was. You always knew how to find what other people couldn't find. I trusted you to find this. I am sorry I could not be there when you did." She sat in the passage for a long time. She did not try to stop crying. She did not try to be quiet. Because there was nobody there to be quiet for, and because the building was solidly built, and the coast wind was loud outside, and she had been holding a very great deal for a very long time. Then she stopped. She sat quietly for another minute. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her jacket pocket. She stood up. She was done sitting on floors. She called the number on the foundation letterhead the next morning. Patricia Howell answered on the second ring. She was professional and warm in the way of someone whose work requires both, and when Dorothy explained who she was and what she had found, there was a pause on the line. Not uncomfortable. More like the pause of someone recalibrating carefully. "We thought the project had simply lapsed," Patricia said. "We held the file open. We weren't entirely sure why. We just didn't close it." "My husband died," Dorothy said. "I'm very sorry. The agreement wasn't signed. But I'd like to talk about whether it still can be. It could." The process of making it so took 8 months, 2 meetings with Patricia Howell in person, a new structural assessment by the same engineering firm Martin had used, whose records confirmed his previous findings, and found them thorough, and a review by the State Historic Preservation Office that proceeded smoothly because Martin had done the documentation work years before and done it correctly, in the precise and organized way of a civil engineer who understood that the paperwork was as important as the structure it described. A property attorney in Harlan Bay named Douglas Fitch handled the legal work. He had known Martin slightly, in the way that people in small coastal towns know each other, and he received the full picture of what Dorothy had found with the expression of a man who was going to be sitting with it for a long time. "He did everything but sign it," Fitch said, looking at the binders spread across his conference table. "He ran out of time," Dorothy said. Fitch looked at her steadily. "He trusted that you'd get there." "Yes," she said. "He did." Paul heard about it from Dorothy directly, on a phone call in October, 8 months after she had stood in the gravel lot on that gray Tuesday in March. She told him plainly, the facts in order, the way Martin had always told things. No drama, no point pressed harder than the facts themselves pressed it. Paul was quiet for a long time when she finished. "He never said anything," Paul said. "He wanted to tell me when it was done," she said. A silence. "Then, Mom, I didn't know the cannery was. I didn't understand what it was." "I know you didn't," she said. "Neither did I." She did not say, but he did. The silence on Paul's end of the line said it for her. Renata called 2 days later, having heard from Paul. The conversation was shorter. Renata said she was glad, and then she said something Dorothy had not anticipated. She said she was sorry. She said it carefully, in the way of someone not practiced at saying it, which made it more rather than less. Dorothy accepted it the same way, carefully, without making more of it than it was, which was already more than enough. The restoration took 2 years past the signing of the agreement, and Dorothy was present for most of it. The Pacific Coast Heritage Foundation brought in a project manager and a historic preservation contractor. But the decisions about what to restore, what to preserve as found, what to make accessible to visitors, required the property owner's ongoing input, and Dorothy had clear opinions grounded in the 14 binders. She knew what Martin had documented with the most care. She knew, from 35 years of living alongside him, what he would have wanted, kept exactly as it was. She found a small apartment above the hardware store in Harlan Bay, 2 rooms, a window facing the water, and she walked to the cannery most mornings. June Tasker came by regularly with her thermos and sometimes stayed half a day. Other people from the town came as well, once word spread that the building was being worked on. People who had grown up knowing it and had stopped letting themselves look at it. The way you stop looking at something you have spent too long grieving. They came and stood and watched the work progress, and sometimes picked up a tool, and by the time the restoration was finished, the cannery had become something it had not been in more than 40 years, a reason people in Harlan Bay came together. The morning the restored cannery opened to the public, Dorothy stood at the entrance and watched people walk in. Families with children who ran their hands along the old sorting tables and asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Couples in their 70s who moved through the space slowly, stopping at the interpretive panels Dorothy had written herself from Martin's binders, reading carefully. A man of about 80 who stood in the middle of the processing floor for a long time, without moving or speaking, and then said, to no one in particular, "That's what it smelled like." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Dorothy understood that what he meant was that the building had gotten something right that she had been afraid it might lose. June Tasker came that morning in her good coat and stood in the doorway of the processing floor, looking at the room full of people, and her face did something complicated that Dorothy recognized as the expression of someone watching a thing they had given up on come back. "He'd have stood right here," June said, without specifying where. Dorothy understood she meant Martin. Yes, Dorothy said. He would have. Martin had been bringing June Tasker a loaf of homemade bread every Christmas. Dorothy learned that fall from June herself. He had driven it out to June's house on the edge of town every December for 7 years running, because June had mentioned once in passing that she lived alone and didn't bake anymore. He had done it without telling anyone, without expecting anything, without making it a thing at all. Dorothy drove to June's house the following December with a loaf she had made herself from a recipe she found in Martin's handwriting on an index card in the kitchen drawer at the apartment. The one drawer she had not yet gotten around to sorting. June opened the door. She looked at the bread. She looked at Dorothy. "He showed you," June said. "He left it in a drawer," Dorothy said. June took the bread. She stood in her doorway for a moment. "Same difference," she said. Paul came to see the Cannery in April, on a weekend when the weather was clear enough to see 40 miles of coast from the Widow's Walk Martin had rebuilt in his first year of working on the building, and that the foundation had incorporated into the visitor experience. Paul stood up there for a long time, looking at the water and the hills and the town below him, without saying much. Then he looked at the building under his feet. "He really did all this," he said. "Every bit of it," Dorothy said. He looked at the water. He looked at his mother. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the house. About the way we handled things." She had been waiting for those words, without quite knowing she was waiting for them, for 2 years. They arrived the way things arrive that you have stopped expecting, quietly, without drama, on a clear April morning with the coast wind coming off the water and the Cannery solid beneath them and everything she needed already within reach. "I know you didn't mean to," she said. "That's enough. There are people who spend their lives building something for someone else, quietly, without explaining themselves, in the particular language of people who show love through work and through preparation and through the making of things they mean to outlast them. They don't always get to the explaining part. They run out of time. And so what they have made sits sealed and waiting, patient in its patience, trusting that the person it was made for will find it. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they find it late, after losses they didn't expect, in a building they almost didn't walk into, on a gray morning when they had nowhere else to go. And the finding changes not just what they have, but what they understand about what they always had. She was 60, and her children handed her the one thing they were certain was worthless. She walked into a boarded-up cannery on the Oregon coast on a gray Tuesday in March. And behind the ice room she found 20 years of love written down in 14 binders, and a letter that began, "I have been meaning to finish this for a while. If this story found you today, thank you for being here. I hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who needs it. And before you go, I have one question. Has there ever been someone in your life who showed you how much they cared, not by saying it, but by quietly doing something for you that you only fully understood later? Tell me about it in the comments. I would love to read every answer. See you in the next one.